Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Susan Poisson-Locke, and I'm an artist, writer, and director of the Decolonising Arts Institute at UAL. You can find out more about the Institute by signing up for our newsletter and mailing list. Just drop a line to Decolonising Arts Institute at arts.ac.uk. I'm very pleased to welcome you to the first of our research season roundtable series under the theme of cultural urgencies, actions towards representation, equity, justice, and well-being. If we could move to the second slide. The Cultural Urgencies Roundtable will take place on Tuesday afternoons throughout March, convened by the Institute's Research Fellows and Associates. Today's event, guest hosted by Professor Shahidha Bari, being the exception. Next week's roundtable will focus on decolonising the university and the role of linguistic diversity, hosted by Dr. Victoria Odeniyi. And on the 16th, Dr. Karani Baroka will convene a discussion on cultural narratives of interlocking crises, COVID-19 and Black Lives Matter. The 23rd will focus on Roma Lives, Reflections on Art and Culture, hosted by Dr. Ileana Selahan. And our final roundtable on the 30th with Dr. Anjali Dalal-Clayton will explore curating Black British art now. All of these are bookable through our Institute events page. Before I introduce Shahidha, allow me to quickly run through some housekeeping reminders. Do be aware that your mics and cameras are automatically muted. You can accept live transcript if required, and you can post questions and comments to the chat box throughout the event. You can also use the Q&A box when this is opened for those segments. Please note that the event is being recorded for the Institute's research archive, and selected excerpts may be shared post-research season. So we kick off today with Decentring Fashion, guest curated by the Cultural and Historical Studies team at LCF and chaired by Shahidha Bari, Professor of Fashion Cultures and Histories. We're very happy to be building on our collaboration with LCF after developing the COVID times Black Lives Matter Index, a resource for staff and students available on our project pages. And we do hope that today's event will spark further collaborations. Decentering Fashion brings together researchers at UAL with colleagues at the V&A to reflect on work that attempts to decenter Western, white, and Eurocentric ideas of fashion. The aim of the session is to think about fashion as a more global network of production and consumption. Participants will present their research and reflect on the challenges and opportunities for fashion studies going forward. Over to you, Shahidha.
Hi there, thank you, Susan, so much. I'm Shahidha Bari, and I'm a Professor of Fashion Cultures and Histories at London College of Fashion, and I'm a member of the Cultural and Historical Studies Department here at LCF, and we're really delighted to be partnering with the Decolonising Arts Institute for this, their first in their series of Cultural Urgencies roundtables. And I hope our event might set the tone for the subsequent conversations that are happening across university sector and the arts sector, and I hope that LCF and the UAL colleges are taking a significant lead with too. Now, we've gathered together a roundtable of speakers from within LCF and with colleagues from the V&A Museum who are going to talk about their research with us and with each other, and it's a very informal setup. We'll hear from each researcher in turn, and we'll encourage conversation between the speakers too. And of course, we'd like to involve you, our audience. So do feel free to pose questions of your own using the Q&A function. And you should see that button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And I'll be coming to those questions and trying to pose them to our panelists in the later half of the discussion. But do feel free to start submitting those questions now as they arise. Before I hand over to our first researcher, I thought I'd say a few words about the thinking behind the event. The aim of the session is to turn the spotlight really on important research, and also to reflect more broadly on the way that fashion studies is reshaping our understanding of fashion itself as a global network of production and consumption. And I have to confess that I elected to call this event Decentering Fashion, partly because I was mindful of how complex and particular the term decolonisation can be, although I think many of us today in this room are also decolonising fashion as well as decentering it. But decentering too is a curious term, which I think is worth lingering on. And I tend to think of it as a term that had a particular currency, perhaps in the 90s and the early noughties. We used to talk very familiarly about decentering Western, white and Eurocentric ideas of history, for instance. And you would often hear it alongside theoretical concepts of marginality and hybridity. And perhaps it's true that in some way, all of the work we're going to hear about today is an effort to dislodge the centrality of those normative ideas of history, culture, and fashion. But I'm mindful too that each of the research areas we're going to hear about possesses its own dignity and curiosity and particularity, and that we as researchers, as I imagine lots of our audience too, are engaged in this work because we're invested in the dignity and the curiosity and the particularity of these specific research areas, independently of whether we think they're part of a larger project to decenter a normative idea of fashion. And one of the things that I'm very alert to is that every community, every group, every person is the center of their own worldview. And the reality is that for each of us, there is no decentering of a monolithic or dominant other. We are at the heart or the center of our own experience and stories. And so this format is an effort to try to give space to the centrality of those experiences and stories by showcasing more various kinds of research. Having said all of that, I also think there's a great deal to learn and good practice to share. When we bring together researchers like this and an audience like you, we have an opportunity to reflect on the value of this kind of work and to think about the challenges we face and how, taken all together, this research might shift the axis of fashion studies and reshape the dominant stories that we want to teach and tell. Okay, so that's it from me. I'm going to hand over, first of all, to Serkan Delice. Now, do remember, you, our audience, can also ask questions throughout, so do feed them through to me through the Q&A function. Let me introduce Serkan. Serkan Delice is a senior lecturer in cultural and historical studies at LCF. His research explores the connections between fashion and politics, with attention to cultural appropriation and its relationship to racial and emotional capitalism, white supremacy, and cultural imperialism. And his work considers fashion production and consumption in the context of political dissidence, immigration, and refugee movements in contemporary Turkey. Serkan, over to you.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Shahida. Thanks to you, as well as to the UAL Decolonising Arts Institute for bringing us together. Much appreciated. I would like to share my slides because I would like to show some images. So, right, can you see my slides?
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. So, my current research aims to understand and interrogate the recent emphasis on diversity and inclusivity in contemporary fashion media. And when I say the recent emphasis, I am really referring to the proliferation of debate around diversity and inclusivity, especially after the digital launch of Vogue Arabia and the subsequent appointment of Edward Enninful as the editor-in-chief of British Vogue. And I'm not against diversity and inclusivity, needless to say, but I believe that representations of diversity and inclusivity in fashion media are often prone to turn into what Professor Stuart Hall, one of the founders of cultural studies back in 1990s, used to call racialized regimes of representation, racialized regimes of representation. Now, we often debate who is visible and who is invisible in fashion media or on the runway, but I believe that now it is time for us to ask a slightly different but equally important question. Who has the power and privilege to create racialized regimes of representation? Who holds sway over the right to represent others? Who has the power and privilege to represent racial, ethnic, and religious differences, for example? So I recently completed an article about the 10th anniversary issue of Harper's Bazaar Arabia, and I think this exemplifies my concerns. And this is the reason why I would like to talk to you about it for 2 minutes. Now, in the midst of the global refugee crisis and the border violence aggravated by Donald Trump's travel ban, the so-called Muslim ban, the 10th anniversary issue of Harper's Bazaar Arabia, published in March 2017, brought together 3 models, namely Shanina Shaikh, who the editorial specifies grew up in a Muslim household in Australia with a father of mixed Saudi and Pakistani origin, and currently resides in Los Angeles, and has recently clocked up 4 turns on the Victoria's Secret catwalk. Hana Ben Abdesalim, from a small village in Tunisia, who is, we are told, the first Arab woman to appear in a global luxury beauty campaign, to front a global luxury beauty campaign, and Hind Sahli from Morocco, who, again, we are told, has appeared in a Miu Miu advertising campaign and lives, quote, in New York's hip Tribeca district, end of the quote. These models are represented as a triumvirate of beauty, poise, and empowerment. They are set to offer an image of a united Arabia. And what's wrong with this, especially given that Harper's Bazaar Arabia, this special edition, provides ample space for the 3 models to convey their distressing experiences of overzealous border control and laborious visa bureaucracy and heightened security measures as a result of their Arab heritage. So this special edition is infused with a strong sense of female empowerment, and we are seeing this warranted stance against Islamophobia. Having said that, this goes hand in hand with what I would like to identify as 3 problematic aspects of decolonization as reflected in contemporary fashion journalism. A, we are seeing an authenticity fetishism that seeks to appeal to the nationalist sensibilities of the audiences. This is one of the reasons why we are given abundant information as to the roots of these models. Secondly, we are seeing a defensive claim to ownership of modernity. Often these fashion magazines keep reiterating that there is no single way of being modern. There is not a single way of being modern, and that modernity is not incompatible with religion or tradition. But actually, this assertion obscures the long history and continuing struggles of secular feminist movements in the Middle East. Not all feminist movements in the Middle East take their reference from religion or tradition. There is a long history of secular feminist movements in the Middle East. And finally, what we are seeing is an interpolation of the grievances and privileges of members of the Arab diaspora into the localized regional narrative. It's blatantly obvious to me that these models are highly mobile, privileged models, and 2 of them are actually members of the Arab diaspora based in the United States. So what we are seeing here is a conflation, if you like, of the diasporic with the regional that provides the magazine with an idealized cosmopolitan look, but then that idealized cosmopolitan look deflects attention from the persistent patriarchal authoritarianism in the Arab world. And this is the reason why I called my presentation the Empire's New Clothes, because it's my contention that under the guise of diversity and inclusivity, what we are seeing is actually a new and consolidated Euro and American centrism. And this is the reason why I argue that any attempt to decenter fashion and any attempt to decolonize fashion is doomed to failure if it doesn't confront racial capitalism, i.e. the process of extracting profit, the process of extracting economic and cultural value from individuals and communities of different racial and ethnic identities.
A really provocative way to start, slightly blow me away. I think the thing I'm going to encourage all of our participants on the roundtable, Cher, Charlie, Divya, Michael, and Lippy to respond if they care to. My initial thought is that I can recognise this vision of an idealised cosmopolitanism, that what we're seeing on the covers of various Vogues and in the personnel on our catwalks and behind our major fashion magazines, as a kind of glossy vision of cosmopolitanism. And what you're proposing, it seems to me, is to present something less happy. It can't be a vision of modernity that is entirely compatible with religion, for instance. And I wonder what you see would remedy this vision, or would be a kind of a riposte to this kind of idealized, glossy cosmopolitanism. Part of it must be an attention to localism and the tensions within localisms too, I think.
Thanks. And I think that's a really difficult question, because often when I talk about these issues, I feel like perhaps I'm coming across as very patronizing, especially given that I'm not a practitioner. So I am much more interested in theory. So I totally appreciate that it's not easy at all to represent diversity and inclusivity. And I think for me, the way out is to keep questioning who has the power and privilege to represent diversity and inclusivity. When we think about the fashion industry, when we talk about the fashion industry, we are talking about an industry, for example, in which there are millions of women workers, but the glass ceiling is still there. The most prominent positions are being controlled by white, straight, privileged men. So I think we will never be able to achieve a genuine representation of diversity and inclusivity as long as those representations are created by privileged white upper middle class heterosexual people. So I think we need to focus on the labor aspect and employment aspect. That's my answer.
I think that's a really helpful response. I wonder if any of the other panelists wanted to respond or offer any thoughts or comments. Feel free to unmute yourself or wave at me if that is the case. If not, I will move on because we are going to run out of time, but I will come back to you all with some more general questions towards the end. Let me move to Divia's work. Let me introduce Divia first of all. Divia Patel is a senior curator in the Asian department of the Victoria and Albert Museum. Many of you may know her work. She was the co-curator of the Fabric of India exhibition, which is a complete sensation and really landscape changing, I think. And she's published widely on contemporary design in India, thinking about fashion, graphics and interiors. Over to you, Divya.
Thank you, Lippy, and thank you for inviting me to this panel. I'm going to try and share my screen. Okay, so my starting point for today's talk is, as you mentioned, the Fabric of India exhibition, which I co-curated and which took place at the V&A in October 2015, January 2016. And the exhibition celebrated the history of Indian handmade textiles from the 3rd century to the present day. And I was responsible for the modern and contemporary sections, so the 2 sections that you see on the right-hand side of your screen. And that was the first time that Indian fashion was on display in the UK in any substantial way. And for me, it was important that the chronology of the exhibition gave context to the contemporary fashion, and it gave primacy to the textile and the handmade. It also displayed 21st century Indian fashion on its own terms, so not in relation to the West. And my aim really was to sort of broaden the perceptions about what Indian fashion might be, and to take it beyond the cliche of the grand Indian wedding as the only design aesthetic associated with India. there were many things that I wanted to do, but one of them was to highlight the role of the maker stroke artisan as well as the designer. Because the Western fashion system is really focused on the designer, whereas in India, this concept didn't really exist before the 70s and really only became a profession in the 90s. Now, before that, obviously, you had tailors and artisans. And so this slide is just a sort of a slide which shows in the center a family of artisans, Aziz and Suleiman Khatri, what they produce for the local market on the right-hand side and what they produce for an international market on the left-hand side. Now, this, of course, highlights the fact that there are multiple fashion systems emerging at different times and interacting globally in multiple ways. For me, it was also important to place so-called ethnic fashion within a ethnic wear into a fashion context to show that if change is a defining feature of the fashion system, then the salwar kameez and the sari are a part of that system, and that tradition perhaps should not be seen as this rigid and invariable, but that it can be reinvented in different contexts. Now, while doing this project, one of the biggest hindrances to researching in this field, in the field of South Asian fashion, is that there are scarce written resources. You know, unlike the libraries that you have on Western fashion, there are few magazines, few publications. There are no museums or archives with modern and contemporary collections to refer to, either within or beyond India. We can, of course, focus on the now, so you can speak to designers, educators, makers in the field and get some good current research. But between the period between 1900 and 2000 is really nascent in terms of research. So following my work on the exhibition, and recognizing that these huge gaps, my current research is to focus on the sari of the 1920s and 50s. Between the 1920s and 50s. And I really want to flesh out Indian fashion history, remove some of the grand sweeping statements and begin to add detail and nuance to the narrative, sort of create multiple histories. And I want to, you know, decenter the idea of the sari as a static, non-changing garment, which is the way it's been sort of perceived in the West, and to show its responsiveness to a host of factors. So, you know, on the right, I'm looking at saris that are inspired by or made of chiffon or new fabrics, new designs that respond to social, cultural, and economic factors. These are areas that haven't been explored. And my experience within the exhibition and my ongoing research have really have fed into the preliminary work that the museum started for a global fashion gallery. The project is currently paused because of COVID-19, but I can share with you the ambitions for the gallery, which was to move from a Western-centric focus to a global perspective. And the prospect of having a gallery where you can see fashion from a variety of countries being given equal weight is exciting and daunting, and would be, of course, decenter approaches to fashion studies, and can help us think of fashion as this more global network that you mentioned, Shahidha. Now, I was one of many people working on this project, and for me, bringing all of this together, for me, for the South Asia perspective, the urgency is to build more nuanced and complicated histories that are of equal weight within the global narrative of fashion history. So it's really to build up complexities rather than flatten out, rather than what we have now, which is a very flat history. So I'll end there.
Thank you so much. I'm just, it's always such a delight to see your work and to go back to the show. I'm sure lots of us went to that show. And actually, I'm just remembering when you showed me around the show, you showed me, I think there was a ready stitch sari. Or there was a sari,
right, yes.
yeah. And I mean, that's precisely your point, that to understand a garment like the sari, not as a static, non-changing garment, but for Indian fashions, the fashion of the Indian subcontinent to be evolving, not simply kind of a historic ethnic artifact that doesn't have its own complexities. That seems to me totally fascinating. I wonder what we do in this situation when you were talking about how to give equal weight and complexity to these histories, how we go about doing that when, as you say, there is not the same archive in the same way as there is with a Western fashion system. And I wonder if you have started to think about how to start giving that weight to that work.
I mean, a part of the process is obviously to get more researchers and people interested to do this, and particularly within India itself, because I tend to find that there aren't, maybe because it's part of lived history, that people don't feel like they need to write it down or they need to do anything with it. And you know, maybe a starting point is actual oral histories within communities out in India itself, in the metropolitan centres. If we're looking at the saris that I'm looking at, the 1920s to 50s, well, people still feel that that's just what they have, you know, certainly the 1950s, and why would anyone find that interesting? You know, and so the need to record is not there. And yet when you start talking and extracting and getting that information down, that makes a big difference. I mean, I think the thing I was talking to you about before was I was frustrated by not having, I couldn't get to India and at this particular time, and I couldn't get hold of, there aren't many magazines written in the 1920s and 50s, to the 1920s, 50s. So what do I refer to? And then I found this great source of information from the Times of India newspaper, which didn't have a fashion column. But if you look at the Times of India from the 1900s to about the 1930s, they have a racing column that talks about the fashion at the races.
Oh, wow.
And so then you begin to read the descriptions, because there are no photographs, there's no color photographs. So you don't know what colors these people, and there's no even sketches, but they describe them in great detail. So, you know, so-and-so wore this sari with this detailing and this blouse, which had puff sleeves on it, whatever, you know. But in the absence of anything else, I tell you that was a gold mine. So that was a sort of eureka moment. But of course, I'd like to back it up with other things. So it's starting, you know, and this is, you know, a tiny section of the vast fashion history that India has to offer. But what I'm saying is that we're so behind, we really haven't collected those histories, and you know, maybe this is a crucial moment to start bringing that forward so that we can then engage better in these global conversations.
That's a brilliant tip, to look at the racing column of newspapers to find the fashion history. But I mean, it does pose that question about, you know, being resourceful and finding and developing new methodologies to be able to track these histories, which I think is fascinating. We should all talk about too. Can I ask our panelists if they wanted to respond or had comments? Feel free to unmute yourself or raise your hand. I mean, we're going to come to Lippy's work in a moment, and I know that Lippy's work will speak quite closely to yours, Divya, and also pick up questions of diaspora, I think, with you, Serkan. So let me introduce Lippy. Lippy Begum is a postdoctoral fellow at the Centre for Fashion Business and Innovation at LCF, and her work focuses on contemporary fashion business, cultures, and social enterprise. She's worked as a sustainability consultant for the UN and the Better Work in Textiles and Garments project for the Bangladesh ready-made garment sector. Her research explores South Asian fashion cultures, and she's the founder of the Muslin Trust, dedicated to preserving Bangladeshi fabrics. Over to you, Lippy.
Thanks for the introduction, Shahida. I mean, I didn't ask Divya or Serkan a question, because I think what I'm going to discuss will sort of respond to what Divya and Serkan have said and some of the questions raised. So my response to the theme of decentering is really what I'll talk about today, is less about going into the theory of fashion and race, but more about the questions that we can ask, and why decentering is valuable, and also, you know, how I do that in my work, and asking the audience questions about how we might also evolve what things that we are considering today. So in my work, I often ask question, you know, did the social, cultural, and economic issue come first, or the fashion trend or fashion response to it? So I'm drawn to fashion and clothing as a tool, a powerful everyday lens to unpack urgent environmental and social issues. So that's how I end up sort of, and in doing so, decentering fashion research and adding to fashion studies. So that's the angle that I often find myself coming into fashion studies from. So it's a bit of a chicken and egg situation. Is it the social issue or is it the fashion trend? So similar to Serkan and Divya, rather than going, can these issues be separated, you know, the trends from the social issues, whether that's past, present or future, I think it's really valuable to look at the idea of sort of the interconnectedness of the histories, the complexity and the ambivalence to the interlinear narratives. So decentering in my research is really about drawing out new narratives of fashion through historical and contemporary connection. And again, it's that interconnectedness between cultures, business and trade. So for example, in my research with the ready-made garment sector in Bangladesh, what I do is explore how there's more to the sector than the mainstream narrative of factory disasters and fast fashion driven polluting industry that's fast fashion driven. It's an industry where 85% of employees are women, offering them some financial independence, power and agency, which other forms of informal work might not provide. You know, similar to what Amartya Sen argues, we don't always look at the achievement of Bangladesh's ready-made garment sector through the sustained positive change in gender relations as a noteworthy contributing factor. I mean, Sen doesn't go into the gender relations and calls for further investigation, and that's where I pick up, you know, looking at gender relations in the past, and you can find that in Bangladesh's strong historical history, there's a historical ethos of gender neutral friendships as a mode of learning, education. There's a history of rebellion and fighting for social justice and women's role in that, in terms of fighting for education and rights to work. So a history that's often overlooked by you know, mainstream media in the face of negative publicity. So what I've found is, like, through interviews with women factory workers who are members of the National Garment Workers Federation, that they're anything but passive as the media predominantly portrays them. But we also learned that the situation is far from perfect and complex and linked to other historical, cultural, racial structures. So for me, it's saying, okay, that's one narrative centered around Bangladesh as an economic basket case. It's not that, but now it's about decentering even further. So the question is, how can that alternative narrative be mobilized to address sustainable practices for the future of the sector and the future of Bangladesh, and sustaining employment for all these women in the sector? How do we now look at that question? So again, it's about moving forward and finding even more connections. So that interconnectedness aspect is really valuable. What's happening in Bangladesh is not dissimilar to how we might understand the value of gendered work across different global contexts and creative sectors. So in the case of my research in global garment industry, you know, I was able to understand the complexity of the situation by better connecting Bangladesh garment workers to the British East India Company, and how clothing and textiles were traded from Bengal since the 17th century. And then more recently, histories of migration, factory workers in Brick Lane, and we may even look at Leicester. So a lot of that research has been done, you know, I feel, through finding innovative ways to accessing stories. So the other element of decentering that's important for my research is not the interconnectedness, but also methodologies, which Shahidha, you mentioned, and I thought I would bring that in while I was there to talk about my work. So for me, what's important, or what I really enjoy as well, is applying innovative methods of research. And what I hear from Divya and Serkan too is that decentering narratives and making those rich connections are challenging and come from piecing together information through various research methods. There's not enough information about, you know, changing styles in the sari and the salwar kameez. There's not artifacts and objects in museums around South Asian fashion as much as we'd like. So it's about going beyond the traditional field and survey research to looking at alternative methodologies. And I think, Divya, you mentioned oral histories to capture sort of lived experiences that mainstream data is often unable to capture. And so what you mentioned, the Muslim Trust. So for example, in my work for the Muslim Trust, a trust that we set up to raise awareness of the rich history of textiles from Bengal, what we are doing with on a national lottery funded project is capturing oral histories of older women living in Merton, in London, and the meanings they attached to their muslin saris when they came to Britain in the 70s. So as an educator of fashion, cultures and business, I find a large part of changing that narrative is being open to applying innovative methodologies from different disciplines, such as museum, curation, advertising, mapping and clustering to capture rich data and stories of regions, and now we're finding within regions. So, north of India, very different from the south of India, the power structures. Similarly, the UK, north of England, very different from the south of England, and how that affects the way the fashion industry operates. So it's about capturing that information, rich information through different methodologies, and also about taking that work into communities or making it accessible through innovative methods, so digital archives or outreach work to support the next generation of fashion scholars or creative industry workers. So there's, ultimately, I feel there is limited scholarship on different subcultures and regions such as South Asia. But I found referring to different types of data ranging from visual cultures such as art, literature, film, a useful starting point for decentering fashion. But I'd like to hear from the audience and speakers about what other methodologies we can use to decenter and overcome some of these centralized or grand narratives. And finally, what I'd like to add is that central to my research and what I'm hearing from Divya and Serkan is about breaking down hierarchies of power, multiple power structures that go beyond East and West, so such as looking at gender, sexuality and class. So power and power dressing and how we perform power is a key theme in my work. So for example, if we visualize a popular business model like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, a step-based approach to motivation, can we apply, is that appropriate for different cultures? Probably not. So can we apply a more circular approach? So I'm thinking more of a spiral of meanings, physiological, social, cultural, esteem needs competing all at once. So for example, when I did some research on the meanings of the bra and lingerie in urban India, looking at competing forces helped me to unpack or illustrated that lingerie consumption in India at the same time of conforming to Western beauty ideals, also moved away from that, bringing out multiple identities of power and sexuality linked to colonial, religious, regional, nationalist history, similar to what Serkan was saying about Vogue Arabia. Modernity and religion, they're not separate. You can have modern and Western and religious all competing at the same time. And that's something that's mediated through local magazine editors. So that's quite interesting to see different, to see there's a growing interest in decentering, not just by academics, but media editors, students, costume designers, emerging designers from the region, which again, I feel points to this idea of interconnectedness, different actors, networks involved in decentering narratives. So for me, it will be interesting to see how that continues and to hear from the audience in terms of what you think about current fashion representations of this interconnectedness and shifting of power within and beyond cultures. But then, we can say, are these narratives really being decentered or recentered? What kind of research needs to take place? Can we really accurately represent history? Think about costume dramas, for example, or representation of men's fashion in history, in Bollywood movies or period dramas. But I won't go into that. I think Charlie will, pick up on that and talk about men's global style, you know, fabulously. But yeah, it's really about interconnectedness, different methodologies, and unpacking it through power structures. So that's where I feel like I'm at with the research on decentering.
You said that last bit so casually. It's just about this. I mean, what I'm so taken by when I listen to you talk about your work is, you know, just how extraordinarily hard a researcher like you has to work to be able to have the measure of the object of your inspection. What I mean by that is that, you know, you're talking about the value of gendered work. You mentioned Amartya Sen. You're thinking about political economy and economy. You're thinking about the history of the East India Company. You're thinking about the history of migration. And so, you know, this is a real methodological challenge to be able to do this kind of fashion studies. Then you need to be tooled up in all sorts of other disciplines. It's you know, truly interdisciplinary, and that seems to me one of the challenges of the kind of work that lots of you are doing. And I'd love to hear more about that when we talk about methodologies. I think my question to you, and I hope the others might have comments too. In this, we're about halfway through. My question to you is also about how there's a kind of reverse value too, that, you know, the work that we're doing or you're doing, you know, is a service to these particular communities and cultures and these fashion histories, but also that there are things that we might learn from this kind of work that would be of value to broader fashion studies. And so in your case, Lippy, I was thinking about the way you talk about how values might proliferate. We might have to start to assess different kinds of values than the ones that we're accustomed to. And that seems to me a really rewarding thing for all scholars of fashion studies to be thinking about. I wondered if you had thoughts on that, about the use of what you're doing for fashion studies more broadly.
Yeah, so I think what I was saying at the beginning is often I come at it from the trend, it's there, the fashion trend. But what it's really about is why that is happening. So for example, waste in the garment industry, or precarious labor, for example. So that's a wider social issue. And because I come at it from fashion and I like the fashion creative industry, I find that a really useful tool to look at these social issues and everyday objects and everyday, you know, material objects like clothing. I feel like, you know, you can find lots of nuance and subtle meanings that you wouldn't usually find by just asking objective scientific questions. So I think that's really the value of fashion studies. So all of this that I'm talking about has come from just wanting to research, you know, something creative, and also just being interested in fashion. So looking at gender relations and clothing, you know, as we're looking at the clothing, it just reveals so much more secret histories, semi-hidden histories, and then you begin to look at different relationships of power, and then, you know, you learn so much about the world and less about the garment, well, garment as well, but, you know, it's just less about just wearing that garment then. So there's such a value in fashion studies if you really take it there. And fashion's very good at borrowing, you know, that's what fashion is about. So I would encourage to borrow lots of methodologies from different disciplines and work in a more cross-disciplinary, interdisciplinary way. And I think that would be like the future of fashion. And we see that with small business owners, they're moving away from just fashion and textiles, they're bringing in technology, and there's science, and fashion is very good at that, and we just have to remember that.
Thank you so much for that. Do our other panelists have any comments or remarks on that? Serkan, you've got your hand up, and I think Charlie was about to say something. So Sir, can you go first, and then I'll come to Divya.
Thanks, Shahida. I think Lippy's emphasis on interconnectedness for me is crucial. One way or another, we are living this interconnected world, and of course, power hierarchies, gross power differences are there, and they are long-standing and persistent. But as the late half Palestinian, half American literary scholar Edward Said was saying, we have got these overlapping territories and intertwined histories. Colonialism was a horrifying, traumatizing experience for the colonized, but it created these overlapping territories and intertwined histories. So I find it really useful because when I think about my work in relation to refugee garment workers, often we say things like, refugee garment workers are invisible, they are being marginalized, but actually they are perfectly within the rhythms of global production. They are there and they are at the heart of the industry. So that emphasis on interconnectedness for me is really important. Thanks.
Divya, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I just wanted to perhaps bring out one of the other elements that Lippi was talking about, and just sort of perhaps the focus on local, the oral project with the women who wear muslin and are recording recording their memories, which is a fascinating local project, but also the local within the nationals that we're talking about. So one of the areas that is really interesting is and that everyone has access to, and they are producing more of our web pages or websites that aren't using the Western voice, but they're using their own voice to explore their own fashions. And there's a lot more of that around, and that's hugely refreshing from being able to not look at India Vogue, but look at the voice of fashion in India to get an alternative perspective. And what are the stories that they're focusing on will be very different from what Vogue India is focusing on. So having more local production and is vital to the bigger narrative. And yes, so Lippi, I don't know if you heard, but I was very interested in your project to do with the oral history that you're conducting, which sounds fascinating. That was it.
Great, thank you. I think there are so many more conversations to have between you two, I think. Charlie, did you want to come in, or would you like me to introduce? Yeah, go for it.
Well, I was just going to say, I was going to echo what both Divya and Serkan said in relation to Lippi's work, and this sort of interdisciplinary aspect of it sounded so fascinating and extremely important. I mean, necessary. It's a sort of form of contextualization, which sort of highlights the sort of the seriousness, if you like, of fashion studies beyond merely the aesthetic, which is important as well, but they go beyond that. There was also a small question. I was just intrigued, Divya, just in relation to your work in India, did you find a regional varieties of difference in relation to sort of archiving and into sort of fashion history in relation to that? When you were looking, I don't know where you went, so enormous, India, whether or not there were, you encountered a kind of different approach to the value of material culture in that way or not? I'm not sure.
I did, it was two-pronged, and but it was several-pronged, in fact. So, I took it from, so one angle was to do the research here in terms of who designers were and go and interview them and do that process. The other was to go to the makers, to particular areas. And for that, I focused on Gujarat because that's the language that I speak and knew that there was a kind of way into production there. And obviously there is a high production of makers within that region. And then so this was research that's built over several visits, several years. And on previous occasions, I've gone into speaking to educators and other people in the field. So it's lots of conversations. And then when it came down to actually sort of collecting, and that was done at a slightly second stage. So quite often it wasn't the acquisitions of these things that was the first thing. It was actually trying to find roots in, and what was I trying to say in relation to this exhibition. And as the exhibition the focus was on handmade, obviously it pushed you in certain directions anyway.
Yeah. Great.
Thank you. That was a really helpful question. We're about halfway through, and I want to remind the audience that you can ask questions via the chat function or via the Q&A function, ideally, and I can ask them on your behalf. We're already getting some really marvelous questions. I've got so many for you as well. I'm going to move to Charlie now, because Charlie Athill is one of our lecturers in the Cultural and Historical Studies Department at LCF. He's also the co-convener of the Masculinities Research Hub at LCF, and he was one of the co-organizers of the Globalizing Men's Style conference, which he's going to talk about now. Over to you, Charlie.
Hi, everybody. I feel rather like the interloper here because I'm not, I haven't come as a researcher in this particular case. I've come to sort of report on something that we did last year, as Shahidha pointed out, outlined there. It was our first digital conference, if you like, and that was the Globalizing Men's Style, which we held. Jay Macaulay-Bosted, who said he can't be here today, and myself as co-conveners. And so it was quite ambitious in lots of ways, because we'd had planned it for John Prince's Street last summer, and then we put a call for papers, and we got very interesting responses. And our idea really was to do, as it said there, to look in a more global way, so more sort of transnational iterations of fashion and expressions, but through different forms of scholarship. So looking at practice as well as representation and history. So a range of different experiences and areas of research, and then how to get a balance and to provide, you know, and to allow a platform for that over 3 days. So we did it in July, and we did it online because COVID came along, and so we had to learn very quickly how to do that, and it was quite a learning curve, but we managed to do it. It was successful. We had good attendance. It was very interesting to do. Fantastic papers. We were very keen, as Jay and I co-convened this hub, which is one of the hubs run by the research department at LCF, but there are other hubs, and we both work, as Shahidha said, for the Cultural and Historical Studies. So we were keen to involve colleagues, not exclusively, but to colleagues, and we did. So we had Michael here, Dr. Michael Macmillan was a fantastic key speaker. Shahidha herself, of course, was a sort of presenter, was extremely, contributed really fantastically with, you know, as a kind of linchpin for questions and for interviews rather. And then we had two colleagues, Talika Kirkland and also Leslie George as well. So in any case, you have some information there. We, as I said, we were hoping to provide a range of papers looking at different aspects of globalized fashion, which wasn't necessarily non-European, but moved beyond the European, and certainly went beyond, if you like, established fashion and established brands and established centers of fashion in the West. So we had, for example, one paper was on Welsh rugby shirts. So that was kind of very interesting. Another one that is quite Eurocentric, and another Eurocentric one was on Australian shorts and a particular kind of study style. So that was kind of key. But beyond that, we did look to, you know, history with, and very broadly. So we went to Japan, Pakistan, India, Turkey, and again, Australia from a more diasporic point of view, and kind of diasporic experiences within Britain as well. So the world is a big place. And so to fit, sort of to get a cross section was quite challenging, but I think we managed to do that overall quite successfully. Anyway, so that ran for 3 days, and where we are now is we're moving ahead. So if you'd like to go to the next slide. There we go. Thank you so much. So from that, we've been in contact with Intellect Books, and we plan to bring out a special edition. At the bottom, you see on the right-hand side, for a special edition from that conference for critical studies in men's fashion, in which we're going to feature eight contributors. One conversation with Vivek Vadalia, who is a British Asian filmmaker who made a fantastic film has done a lot of work about photography and film, but for us, he featured his Kasagorod Boys, which you see there, the link to. I don't know if we have time to look at that now, but that's a really very interesting foray into a particular kind of subcultural existence, if you like, or sort of youth culture that exists amongst Muslim boys in a town called Kasagorod, which is in Kerala. So that was extremely interesting there. Thinking about subcultural identities, if you like, from that point of view. Prema Levan does a lot of work. She's a PhD student at LCF. And she had done a lot of research about her community, where she originally is from Nepal. So she's not a Gurkha, but she's from Nepal, I believe. So she was looking at diasporic identities amongst young Gurkhas in Britain, with a film to accompany that, which is really interesting. As I mentioned, we had Talika Kirkland looking at the relationship or the link between design and statement, I suppose, within a particular framework, an African framework. So drawing links between what you see in the top left-hand corner, which is the Durbar in Zazao, which is a sort of ceremony which is in a particular emirate in northern Nigeria, which is it's a fantastically flamboyant ceremony, and drawing links between that and contemporary African designers in knitwear, and looking at how links from a sort of African diasporic point of view, kind of making sense of those. She's the founder actually, and of CIAD, which is the Costume Institute for the African diaspora, as well as being one of our colleagues. So she certainly is an expert in fabric and, of course, African design and history in relation to textiles. So that's very important. So that was really a fantastic one. So that sort of focused on a particular regional sort of approach, if you like, generally, but then we looked at things more in a more focused way. For example, with Leslie George, who, as I mentioned, is a colleague of ours, and she had worked for a long time in the Gulf, and her interest had been initially in women's wear in the Gulf, the abaya, and she then moved into looking at sort of menswear and men's style, and looking at significance of different iterations of types of kandura, which are these kind of, as you see at the top of the page in the middle there, a sort of Gulf dress for men. I believe that one is from the one on the right, on the left rather, is from Qatar, and then you have Kuwait, and then you have the UAE where she worked and lived, and finally the dark one on the right hand side is Saudi Arabia. So she was looking at like that, and Khaliji style, which is sort of refers to a kind of modern Gulf, a modern Gulf expression of sort of a modernity within the Gulf, if you like, with particularly with the focus on material culture clearly there. In relation to actually design itself, we were very interested to incorporate people practitioners, and at the bottom in the middle there you see Lesiba Mabitsela, who is a designer, and stylist, but he's a designer really, properly describe him as that, and working in South Africa, from South Africa, but he's also worked quite a lot in Holland and has exhibited there as well. So his work goes beyond, it's kind of art as well as material culture in that sense, I suppose. And he was really interested in his work deconstructs Western tailoring. So it's really looking at sort of alternatives, if you like, to a Eurocentric voice. And I think it's very interesting what Shahidha talked about, which is this idea of which terms to use and decentering. She's so right that I think that decentering is about, looking at the centrality of diverse spaces and how these merge as well. And also, of course, diversity within particular areas. Prabhat Mishra is an academic in India who is working on wants to write about Pharaonian fashion nights, which were these fashion shows being held in Jaipur and other places in India that were the first to feature queer, to put it, I think, to sort of summarize, sort of queer fashion, non-gender specific fashion, put that on the catwalk. So I think that's a kind of very urgent conversation to be had, particularly in that setting there. And finally, well, not finally, but the other two we have here, Sang Thai, who is an Australian Thai academic and designer who was looking at the way that T-shirts, very interestingly, can kind of counter particular hegemonic kind of approaches to both ethnicity and also in Australia, but more broadly, ethnicity and sexuality. And finally there with Graham Roberts at the top, who is works in France at Nanterre, and he has done a lot of work on with various Russian creatives, and this focus here he's interested in is looking at Slava Mogutin, who is sort of one of the, along with Ruchinsky, is a sort of a major figure in sort of the Russian wave, if you like, in design, styling, photography, etc. So these are the people who we are going to feature, and they're just sending in their abstracts now. And so beyond that, and we have an idea to work with Bloomsbury for other contributors.
Thank you so much, Charlie. I think we're all, those of us who didn't get to go are kicking ourselves, but we can look forward to the book. And Vivek's video is on YouTube, isn't it? Are there any other proceedings we could see? Yeah.
It's on YouTube, and you can find, yes, and if you put Casa Garod Boys, it's there, and it's very short. It's about 7 minutes, but it's great. Yeah,
it is.
Really
Yeah,
good.
it's really amazing that his work. And actually, it's quite a nice segue into to Michael, who's next, because I mean that conference.
And to Michael again for being so brilliant in the conference.
He was so amazing. But I mean, that conference was about thinking about how really understanding masculinities through dress, global masculinities, and the changing shape of masculinities, and in really unexpected ways with the Kasaragod boys. But let me introduce Michael, because he might talk a little bit more about his own work in his own terms. Michael Macmillan is a visiting lecturer, playwright, artist, and curator. His research focuses on the creative process, ethnography, oral histories, material culture, and performativity. He was the curator behind the exhibition My Hair, Black Culture, Style and Politics at the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology in Cambridge, and many people will know this, the West Indian Front Room at the Jeffrey Museum in London. His research explores Black, British, and diaspora style. Over to you, Michael.
Thank you very much, Shahidha, and thank you also for inviting me to come and do my thing. Can you see that?
Yeah.
We can see it. Perfect.
Okay, so let's move to the previous slide. So I thought I'd put this together. I put this together just now, actually, because I thought I didn't come with anything. I better come with something. So I put together 3 pieces of work, because I thought, I'm going to speak to the work in a way to address this question of decentering fashion, And I often feel like I'm a bit of an interloper, really, because I'm a bit of a disciplinary whore. I flirt between lots of different disciplines. What's interesting in doing that is you realize, you get a sense of the disciplinary orthodoxy and why people need to protect disciplines. But in doing that, you know how to break the rules. So that's interesting. So just picking up Libby's point and Serkon's, disciplinarity is the only way, disrupting that Eurocentric kind of synchro art form factors. Anyway, this is a work, The Front Room, and it was the West Indian Front Room at the Jeffrey Museum, the most successful exhibition they ever had, apparently, which is now, in this later iteration, going to be made permanent. And that is significant because thinking of diversity and inclusion, I wasn't prepared to be a difference that make no difference after Stuart Hall, unless it's permanent, because I'm not going anywhere. I'm here, this is my home, even though, you know, in terms of double consciousness, I have to leave the country to be called British. So the room is now going to be, this iteration is now going to be made permanent at the new Museum of the Home. And its renaming actually is a sign of shift, a turn. And it happened at the time of the emergence of the Black Lives Matter. And I went to them and said, I hit that iron, you know, because this is the moment. I thought, folks, we only got a few months here when it goes back to what it was before. And we, you know, white liberals need to do something, and we need to hit it now. So they said, yes, let's go for it. And in it being permanent now, I'm having a different conversation with them about a different type of knowledge, a knowledge that often doesn't get included within things like interior design and British social history, a knowledge that creolizes the domestic space. I mean, I am very interested in material culture, and particularly Black diasporic material culture. And I did an event recently, an online event about the room, the front room, and it was just amazing what that space, what it allowed people to do, to talk about their interiority from a class point of view, but also an ethnic point of view that doesn't get talked about in interior design. So this is now going to be permanent, as I said, and I was there yesterday at the museum, and they were installing. And what was really interesting for me was thinking about, they're recreating a whole series of period rooms. And one of them is the 1990s, a gay couple who live in Hackney, who lived in a loft conversion. That's going to be one of the period rooms that signifies coming into the noughties. I mean, they're going back to the Victorian era. But what's been also useful for me is being as an intervention is to relook at all of their labels, going back to the 15th century, and reinsert the narrative of colonialism and imperialism within the creation of the British home. So people think, oh, tea and coffee, where did that come from? To reinsert, well, this is how it came, folks. And the China that we drink from, this is how it got here, folks. So that's been really quite fascinating. The other thing in relation to the Museum of the Home is that last year I did a piece, I wrote a piece, because I come from a theatre background as a playwright, and it's always in my blood. So I was invited to create a site-specific performance piece in the Jeffrey Museum's almshouses. I don't know if you know, the Jeffrey Museum is a series of almshouses that go back to the 17th century, created by Sir Robert Jeffrey, who made his money from slavery, sugar, spice, and slaves. And there was a call from the public to remove the statue. And the staff at the museum wanted to, in fact, in response to that public request. But they were told in no uncertain terms by the Department of Media and Culture that if they remove the statue, their funding will be cut. So these are the forces we are fighting against in terms of the decoloniality. Yes, forces who have a neoliberal vested interest in maintaining the capitalist status quo. Anyway, we did this piece called Waiting for Myself to Appear, which is a term I took from the filmmaker Arthur Jaffra. And it's about really one woman playing two characters. A Black woman who works at the museum now as a museum attendant. And I must remind you that the Jeffrey Museum and who I'm working with is largely white middle-class women. But we hope that's going to change at some point. But this woman, the fictional character, she discovers in the archive a Black nurse who escorted the wife of one of the chaplains of the 19th century to England from Jamaica. And doing further research, we realized that that Black nurse was not a person who helped sick people. She was a wet nurse. In fact, she was, her breast milk was used to wean white babies because during the 19th century, breastfeeding was considered disgusting. So middle-class white women did not breastfeed their babies. You had wet nurses. And we find that throughout slavery that Black women's bodies, probably other brown women's bodies, were used as wet nurses as well. And I wanted to unpack this emotional body trauma. What did this mean? How was this that her body was used to wean a white child where her own child had to be left without? And I wanted to explore that further. So I created a character, fictional character called Mary, who we meet at the beginning of the 20th century, 1911. The museum is just, the almshouses are just about to be sold because at that time, urbanization is increasing. And it's a kind of take on gentrification now because the almshouses were sold and rented out somewhere else. But I deliberately dressed this woman not like a classic Edwardian person, but someone who is engaged in modernity. She dresses in a suit. She goes out in Hoxton because she is empowered. She is using that masculine power deliberately, consciously within the street, but also to feature something of a Black woman now who is a bit of ahead of her time. She's a modern woman. And that for me was important because it kind of connects with the Decolonizing Art Institute, because I don't know if you know the origins of that, is actually the Black Artists and Modernists project led by Sonia Boyce. And that's significant for me in terms of the position, the intrinsic relation of not only Black artists, but the Black body and Black culture within modernism, but also other types of modernism that exist, yeah? And this is important for me thinking as a post-colonial subject, engage with modernity and other types of modernity, that there are other, European modernism is not the only form of modernism that's going on. There are other forms of modernisms going on. So that piece is now going to be a film. What you see here on the right, it's going to be an installation, a free-stream triptych. It's going to be large scale and it's going to be at the museum. And I worked with Dub Morphology to create this. The actor her name is Esther Niles. She was wonderful. And we've also used archive images from Autograph, who did a seminal exhibition called Black Chronicles 2, which feature Black Victorian subjects, portraits of Black, because we don't see this. We think we just arrived here in 1948 in Windrush, not sense that there's been a Black presence here for hundreds of years, some would say to the Romans, but you know, that's another story. So I deliberately used those images. How am I with time? And then finally, I've just written a piece for Pamela Church Gibson called Daddy Cool, Aging Black Male Bodies and Embodied Style, which is me really at this moment. And for a while, you know, I did the Saga Boys, Rude Boys and Sagas, Rebellious and Black Masculinities, and that's been published, and it was really wonderful to present it at the conference last year with Globalizing Men's Fashion with Charlie and Jay. But Pamela gave me a space to really rethink about masculinity and masculine dress and my own body. And I thought, actually, I want to move on from that. I want to think about aging male bodies as a space of exile. But also, what is that late style to think of Edward Said? Edward Said had this brilliant essay called Late Style, where he looked at kind of classical artists and so on, and thinking about the kind of the discordance of this late style in a sense. And it's something I'm kind of engaging with. So this informs a kind of current research. And these images, my own images, on the right, they're taken at dances and funerals. So this guy here in this lovely African robe is actually at a funeral. I think he's one of my cousins, actually. But I just took them because I thought, well, someday they're going to be useful. And the one on the left, he's the sheriff. And he was at a dance in North London. And the interesting thing about this dance is that it's a kind of revival dance for people of my generation who were ravers back in the day. And we all dress up and we all participate in couples dancing, which young people don't seem to do anymore because they consider it disgusting. But yeah, and what we find is that in terms of the club space, and I'm still a raver, you find that young people now want to almost pornographize themselves in terms of women's bodies rubbing up against men's crutches, which is another kind of commodification of the kind of dance space, rather than a form of dancing, couple dancing, which is quite ethical in a way. It's not dirty dancing, bodies are respected, but there's a sense of sensuality and eroticism with this form of dancing, which hopefully will come back again. Anyway, that speaks to a big body of work I'm just editing at the moment called Sonic Vibrations, which is about sound system culture, lovers rock and dub, which is going to be published by the Royal Literary Fund. I am a member of the Royal Literary Fund, and it's going to come out in April. And it's a multimedia piece. And it features a lot of women because sound systems tend to be seen as a male domain, and I wanted to disrupt that. And so we have quite a few women involved in this anthology. So hopefully I've kind of raised some things there and hopefully addressed this question of decentering fashion. When you mentioned it, Shahida, I kept thinking of Isaac Julian and I think Kwabena Mercer's essay, Dissenter and the Margin. Brilliant essay.
Yeah.
Written a few years ago. Yeah.
That's it's great to. Well, I mean, that's what I'm interested in. That I was interested when you said you struck while the iron was hot, and that that we've seen this moment before where we've attempted to decolonize the curriculum or think about post-colonialism, and these moments come and then they pass. And a question is how we make the work we're doing enduring and have more lasting effects, as well as galvanizing and making changes to the curriculum and the way our museums operate. Michael, I'm so sorry, but we're going to rush on because we're going to run out of time. I'm just going to let everybody know that we're going to run to 3:40, which would be 10 minutes longer than we needed, but please, we originally advertised, but please do leave if you want to, and please do keep asking questions. Let me introduce our last speaker, and that's Cher Potter. Cher is an LCF V&A Senior Research Fellow in Design Futures. She's co-founder of the Afrodesignex network with Mugundi. My screen just became huge and I lost my script, with Mugundi Muritaya. I think I mispronounced that. You'll correct me, Cher, hopefully. Which brings together designers, technological innovators, and material culture scholars from Johannesburg, Nairobi, Dakar, and Accra, and London to investigate how design is responding to large-scale social and environmental change. She's co-author of Design and Futures, published in 2019. Cher, over to you.
Oh, great. Okay. Thank you so much for the introduction, Shahida, and thank you so much to all of the speakers for an absolutely amazing afternoon of presentations. It's so inspiring. Just a quick question. Can everyone see the slides? Okay, great. Okay, so as Shahida mentioned, I'm LCF V&A Research Fellow in Design Futures and a South African British design researcher. So to put this title of being a research fellow in Design Futures into context, prior to starting my fellowship, I ran the creative direction at a company called WGSN, which is a trend forecasting company, where we produced what's known as the macro trends, so essentially kind of socio-cultural drivers that kind of underpin fashion trends. So, really interesting in terms of what Lippy was talking about. And today I work across the research departments at the V&A and LCF. V&A research, for those of you who don't know, is in part established to look into new areas of collecting. And my work, along with others, involves trying to build a collection and knowledge around 21st century design from creative hubs, including Johannesburg, Dakar, Accra, and Nairobi. So at LCF, I work with the research department to help establish networks and activities that support this research, and also essentially to try and write it up. And really, we write it up in a kind of design historical kind of method of object studies, and kind of unpacking a particular object to understand how it challenges particular categories or processes of design. I also teach on the MA Fashion Futures course. And so, yeah, as a trained design historian working in design futures in a museum context, you could say I'm kind of in an ambiguous temporal space. But as is often argued, design is inherently future-facing in whatever period it is produced. And if you'll allow me a quick quote by the designer inventor Herbert Simon, I think it kind of sums up the way that we are framing fashion within the project that we're working on. So he said, everyone designs who devises courses of action aimed at changing existing situations into preferred ones. And with that, I'd like to jump into a project that we're running. By we, as Shahidha was saying, Afrodesignex was launched with Magendi Amrita, who at the time was president of the World Design Organization and is still a very prolific kind of activist for South African and wider African design. Afrodesignex is run as a transnational network of designers, curators, and scholars across the UK and the cities that I mentioned, so Dakar, Accra, Johannesburg, and Nairobi. And since 2015, we've organized conferences, exhibitions, design workshops, film studios, you name it, pop-up radio stations. And I wanted to just give you a really, really quick summary of the three kind of phases of the research culminating in a kind of closer look at fashion. So in phase one of the project, we looked at digital craft and robotics. This was led by Yoka Kosa in Accra. And it was really about how kind of pioneering robotics initiatives in Accra and Kampala are transforming DIY toy design histories in each of these cities. The next phase of the research looked at digital storytelling in video games and invited a new generation of games designers in Nairobi to share the way that they were translating Pan-African mythological narratives, which actually are being very kind of rigorously gathered through oral history methods, how these were being translated into digital content and gameplay. And then in the third stage of the project, which was run with the designer Xavier Zulu, which is of course most relevant to today's discussion, it focused on how designers were using kind of local and international fashion styles to construct 21st century Afrocentric identities. So designers like the Sartists, here the focus was very much on South Africa and actually specifically Johannesburg. So designers like the Sartists, the Smarties, and many others who are kind of reenacting or reimagining distinct fashion histories in Johannesburg as a way to forge histories of design rooted within the city. And as Serkan was saying, this is not really, the attempt was definitely not to kind of produce sectarian histories. It was more just to understand histories rooted in place. And this was kind of extended in the later part of the project to include Dakar, and we worked very closely with Sally Rabi Khan in that case. So these practitioners are actively trying to change or redesign the fashion frameworks within which they practice. To give you a really quick kind of view of some of their work, this is the Smarties, who were kind of really pioneers actually in the early 21st century, so early 2000s, in trying to kind of write South African township style, so Soweto specifically, South African Soweto kind of iconic style into a kind of distinctive South African fashion history. Knitwear designers like Laduma and Kokolo using digital knitting programs to weave Xhosa beadwork histories from the 1800s into his contemporary knitwear collections, and also kind of running very kind of complex debates around ideas of appropriation. Fashion designers like Sally Rabi Khan, who in fact calls herself a social historian or social innovator, using virtual reality to recreate Senegalese mythological worlds within which her garments are then placed. And finally, a group I'd like to focus on a little more is the design collective called the Sartists. They call themselves specifically documentarians who use style as their medium. And they kind of, their practice operates within the context of Johannesburg, where Black sartorial histories went largely unrecorded by apartheid archives. And the Sartists kind of search out these lost style histories in old photographs gathered from personal archives, thrift stores, and then reenact them as a way to kind of revitalize these narratives for a current generation of designers. Their message, according to Wanda Lafota, one of the members, is our collective design futures lie in exposing overlooked design histories. So again, this really interesting kind of connection between the importance of every design future having its history, being mobilized via history. In a recent work by the Sartists called Our Tribe, they've presented a study on contemporary or post-94 generation, which in South Africa is called the born-free generation. So they've presented a study on contemporary tribalism of the born-free generation in Johannesburg. And in doing this, they kind of overlay a whole set of references, which, as Serkan was talking about, this idea of kind of overlapping and interconnecting different kind of territories. And these kind of objects, which I suppose result in an ensemble, make reference to South Africa's Zulu tribe, the international Stusi tribe, hypebeast online tribes, 20th century South African subcultures of the Pansula and Swankas, and apartheid activist groups of the Inkatha Freedom Party. What's quite interesting about the kind of way in which they approach fashion, and they're very, precise about this, is that they're essentially trying to reconfigure some of the imperial categories of fashion and dress and present these in their own terms. So, where fashion is often seen as contemporary and tribal dress or so-called tribal dress is something that's non-changing or traditional, which is something that Divya was talking about as well. They really want to kind of make the statement that all of these objects, all of these kind of sartorial objects within this image are part of a contemporary lived experience. And rather than saying isikwaza or the nopkari or the chokwe mask within the image are part of fashion, they really say that actually they're all part of contemporary tribal dress. And that's a really kind of, they say, that this idea of, trying to reconstitute objects such as masks, for example, within the fashion industry or within the fashion kind of studies framework doesn't make sense to them, but to understand everything as part of a kind of vast repertoire of tribal dress is more interesting. And I think poses some really interesting questions for us as people who study fashion. So these practitioners adopt methods from documentary filmmaking and photography, but also, I think most importantly, they borrow from the historian's toolkit. So they're using archival research, oral histories, historical reenactments. They claim to be historians or researchers of fashion, but their practice is, of course, grounded in practice. Today, when we talk about this idea of fashion research, that they might point towards a kind of emergent trend in fashion research where more designerly modes of exploration are being used to decenter or revitalize or reenact multiple centers of sartorial histories for future generations.
Thank you so much, Cher. That was completely fascinating, and you raced through it. We have about 3 minutes left, but if people need to slip off, absolutely, it's not your it's not your fault. It was just we've all overrun. If people need to slip off, that's absolutely fine. But I'm just going to pose the two questions that have come up, I think, significantly in our discussion and in the Q&A. And perhaps it picks up from your example of the Sartists, that they're, this idea of recreating fashion history from photographs when a history is suppressed or lost, in this case because of apartheid. But the question is from Felicity, and it's about methodologies and about innovative methodologies. And I think this is useful for anybody listening. Are there any specific approaches or tools for research in this field? What are you doing that you feel like is an innovative methodology that is advancing this work in decentering fashion? Is anybody interested in sharing some of that? I know some of you have mentioned it already. Lippy, it was sort of directed at you, and I wonder if you have thoughts very quickly.
I mean, I thought it was a really interesting question. I guess what's innovative in one discipline might be old hat in another. Right? I think that's it's quite hard to say something is innovative. So what Cher was saying, you know, the more designer way of thinking or participatory methods might be a way to be more innovative, where a lot of research is objective or scientific, or there's a trend towards that. So it's just breaking that. And I think someone else mentioned, you know, how do you include the people that you are researching and give them a voice? So I think an innovative methodology is really a method that will give your participants voice. So oral histories was mentioned, making, designer methods, or it could be, you know, data that's gathered, but that's more representative. So we know that with big data and tech, for example, you know, there's a lot of algorithm bias because the people behind it. So it's really about who's behind the work that will lead then to the innovation and lead to the access. So it's difficult to say one method is more innovative than other. But obviously technology allows us to do more, but does it necessarily mean it will be used in the right way to give access or solve the problem that it was initially set to solve?
Serkan?
Thanks to Felicity Coleman, who is the LCF Associate Dean of Research, for the question. Actually, Felicity and I had a conversation about this at some point, but in terms of methodology, I have benefited hugely from the writings of Achille Emembe, and actually I've just copied and pasted a link into the chat panel. What I have gathered from him is that it's important for us to conduct large-scale, all-encompassing analysis that looks at the interactions between different individuals and communities rather than area studies. And I think that's really helpful. One example of this is a recently published book by Lisa Rofel and Silvia Yanagisako, which is called Fabricating Transnational Capitalism. And they look at how Italian and Chinese entrepreneurs interact with each other in the field of fashion to fabricate transnational capitalism. And finally, what I realized as a kind of, as part of my research, my conversations with refugee garment workers, at some point I realized that when I was conducting interviews, I was always treating them as workers only, as merely workers, right? For me, they were just garment workers, and my perception of them was almost completely detached from fashion. From my perspective, they didn't have anything to do with fashion. They were just garment workers. And later I realized that this was actually a very problematic approach, because I was reproducing that hierarchical division of labor by relegating them to workers only. And then I started exploring their perceptions and practices of fashion, taste, distinction, style. And I think that allowed me to confront that hierarchical division of labor within the industry. So I realized that actually my mind was not a safe space at all. I was very judgmental. I was very prejudiced in some ways. So I guess those are some of the potentially innovative methodologies that I just want to draw your attention to. Thank you.
And that takes us very nicely to the other question that was asked, which I think is quite important, and perhaps it can be our ending note. And I'd love to hear from all of you if you have things to say to it. And it was from Tegan and Louise, or perhaps Louise Tegan. How do you recommend approaching decentering fashion and presenting marginalized communities' stories, fashion history, without your own voice as an outsider being too present? I mean, you've started to answer that in some way, Serkan, but are there answers to that question, which I think is a very sensitive question?
I think I was saying earlier about some of the approaches, the participatory approaches or oral histories could help. But again, you know, how do you completely eliminate the researcher or how established they are and how much voice that person might get. So I think we can keep doing more to include voices. So the more diversity, slowly we sort of break down whose voice always get covered. But I don't think there's a shortcut.
Michael, you look like you're leaning in to say.
I think it begins with positionality. Who are you? Where do you come from? And what is your position in relation to what you're looking at? And also, what is the self and other in relation to yourself? We are all self and other, yeah? And because of that, we enter a process of othering. So in thinking about that question of alterity, how do we bring that into being, to make that clear? And I think in the academy, we tend not to do that. And it's a lot of rubbish, I'm afraid I'd say. Subjectivity is it. Yeah, basically, that's it.
Yeah.
Fundamental.
Divya, I wondered if you had experience from your own work curating your show about how to, your show was such a sensitive one, but how to keep a kind of graceful presence in the work without overbearing it all.
I mean, we did as I said, one of the things we wanted to do was get authorship for the makers and agency for the makers. So spaced throughout were short films showing process in which, at which the end of, we had the makers' names and the families' names and whoever was in the film, which is not something you normally get. Yes. We tried for historic textiles where we could, and this is quite rare, to put the makers' names. And there are some that exist for things that were made in the Great Exhibition, for example, or others. And then, of course, coming all the way to the contemporary, certainly with the work that I did in some of the villages in Gujarat, obviously I was able to speak to them more and get their own voices. So that comes out more in the book because I was able to do that. And again, we were able, wherever we could, it wasn't just the designer name, but it was the design, the maker, the artisan working on it. So we were quite clear that there were several people involved in making of the final garment. So I think that's one thing. This is very early stages. That's what we could do then. Now, when we acquire, it's again going to be the same thing. I do question everyone who I acquire pieces from as to, it's not just the designer name going on there. Can you tell me who made it, and can we speak to them, and so forth. So it becomes, it's become part of that process, which is great. But again, it doesn't eliminate you completely. You are there making and asking and pushing to get those answers.
This is we've completely run over time, and I'm going to let you all go, even though we have thousands more questions. It's all your fault because you were all so interesting and I couldn't bring myself to tell you to stop talking. We have to have another event, I think. Let me say thank you to each of you, our wonderful panelists, Second Elise, Divya Patel, Lippy Begum, Charlie Athill, Michael Macmillan and Cher Potter. Thank you also to the UAL research team who helped organise this event, namely the heroic Lynn Finn, and also to Decolonising Arts Institute, particularly Claire Pattenden and Susan Poisson-Locke. The next Cultural Urgency Roundtable they are running is on the 9th of March at 2 p.m. on decolonising language. And if you'd like to find out more about the work we do in CHS, the Cultural and Historical Studies Department at LCF, then you might like to attend our next online research seminar, which is today, actually, this evening at 5:15, and I've just shared a link in the chat box. I think Lynn might, in fact, share an image of our programme. We run an online research seminar, which has a really lively programme, some of which you can see here, and it's free to attend and it's online. If you'd like to find out more, you can go to the link I've shared or you can email me, and I'll thank you all. You can find our events on the UAL events page too, and what a marvellous discussion. We've got so much to pick up. Thank you again. I hope if you're listening, watching from home, you might give us a virtual round of applause to our marvellous guests, and I'll let you all go. Thank you so much. Goodbye.